Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to this self-knowledge course. Today, we'll see a very interesting topic, as always, and it is the 33rd topic of this cycle of 50 lectures that are the first part or phase A of this course, whose purpose is that we have the necessary tools to awaken our consciousness and that we really get to know ourselves to the self-realization of our being. Today, we will talk about two laws of force, which are the law of octaves and the law of entropy. And let's say that the objective of studying this topic is for us to know how these two laws of the force work and how they actually subdue us, and how by knowing them we can use them to ascend through the wise use of the musical octaves in our lives, and through combating the entropy, that is the law that always seeks to make us like equal to the rest of humanity, so that with this, let's say, knowledge, we prevent us from descending on our path towards the intimate self-realization of the being. So we are going to start by explaining that or what is the law of octaves. The law of musical octaves is also known as the current of sound or the current of life, since we'll see that just as the musical notes always ascend from lower tones to higher tones, ascending in their vibratory levels, each higher going from a lower octave or lower vibratory levels to a higher octave or higher vibratory levels, or we can say levels of consciousness in the case of our inner work. And the law of octaves teaches us to ascend. It allows us to see where we are stuck, why we are stuck in our progress, and how to continue ascending until we reach the final goal. If we observe the musical notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, and do, and that the seven notes corresponds to a musical octave. We'll see that to go from the lower do to the higher do, it is necessary to rise one more octave, a whole set of 7 notes. But it is interesting to observe how all of us human beings and all our processes and all our projects are subject to this vibratory scale or current of life at the same time that we are subdued to it. We are going to see that just as when we begin to sing a musical scale, when we start do, re, mi, when we reach mi, we find like the first pause between the notes mi and fa, and then the following 3 notes, which are fa, sol, la, go together. But when we reach la, we find the second pause between la and ti, and then moving to the ti note, we see that it is independent, and that to move to the higher do, we find the third pause between the ti and do. That do belongs to the higher octave. And we will see that we are going to find those same 3 pauses whenever we push ourselves to take anything from a lower level to a higher level. In any aspect in our life that we want to undertake and that we want to take it to a higher level, we are going to find or we are going to have to break with those 3 pauses. And those impulses that are going to lead us to start and that are going to allow us to break with those pauses is what we call a shock. And to illustrate this, we could give the example of any company or business that we decide to undertake. We will need a boost. Can it be encouragement or an investment to start up the business? That will be our first shock. But always and inevitably, we are going to find that after starting buying the equipment, the raw material, finding the workers, and so on, there will be a process of stagnation, a pause, maybe in the difficulty of opening up a field in the market, for example. And if the company doesn't give itself that second impulse or the second shock that may imply making a new investment or an effort in the search for relationships or clients, etc., that progress could be stale and gradually lose that strength and can return to the point from which the business departed from the very beginning. On the other hand, if the company owners give themselves that impulse or give to the company that impulse, that second shock, then they would rise to another point on that scale in which they would begin to produce, to generate profits, etc. But they will also reach a certain point. Let me just a second, let me check something here. Okay. They will also reach a point where they will face new difficulties that could lead again the business to stagnation and setbacks, such as the competition they find in the market or the rising in the cost of the raw materials, etc. And again, in order to continue ascending, they will be faced with the need to give another shock, another impulse. They until they can take that business to an unstable level. But and you can see it is the same. But really, we can see this in anything we undertake. We could see it in a couple relationship, for example, that we start. And if we analyze it, we'll see how these three pauses gradually and inevitably occur, and that the majority of relationships, which are the ones that fail, break in one of these pauses and are caught by the law of entropy, which we will talk about later. So we'll see that the law of octaves is actually in everything at a micro level, but we will also see, or we could also see it in a macro level in relation to our own existence and to the very purpose of our existence, which is to achieve the self-realization of the being. So in us, seeing this scale, these octaves in what is our entire existence, the first shock occurs at birth, when inhaling the first breath, when in that first breath is where the spark definitely enters the new body. Although it has been connected to the body during the 9 months of pregnancy, the very entrance, of course, when the child inhale that first breath of life. With that shock, we are entitled to the first 3 musical notes, do, re, and mi. These are equivalent to the physical body, which is the note do, the vital body, which is the note re, and the soul principle that we all have, where 97% of our essence is trapped in our ego, the myself. And this accompanied by a personality with which we develop in the physical birth. And with these 3 notes, we actually grow, we reproduce, we achieve material or personal success. We grow old and then we die, but without any real objective. And each existence actually could represent an opportunity to continue ascending the ladder or to, on the contrary, return to the starting point. And actually, this one is the most common that we spend a lifetime without even finding a purpose for our existence, and that by law of entropy, we all end up like being matched in the cemetery, having to return again to a new existence, and that again and again in different physical bodies until we exhaust the 108 existences or opportunities with a human physical body that we have for each cycle of manifestation. The vast majority of humanity never managed to transcend that first pause. They actually remain engrossed in the meaningless search for pleasure and search for success, and in trying, to flee from pain and to flee from adversity. And this kind of people are the so-called men of the third day. They are fascinated and mesmerized with life without even knowing the reason of their existence. To transcend that first pause, we need to receive that which will give us that second shock, that impulse to break that pause and continue moving up in that ladder. We have the possibility of giving ourselves that second shock when we receive the objective knowledge. There we will discover that our existence has a much greater purpose than what we had seen until now. And once we receive the knowledge of the three factors for consciousness revolution, that are the psychological death, the self-observation of our psychological defects, where our soul is actually trapped, and that soul, that essence is the raw material to start creating the existential bodies of the being, and the judgment of each of these defects, and petition for death to the Divine Mother. That is the psychological death. We've been teaching the ongoing death and the reflective meditation. But also the next factor, which is a spiritual birth, which is the wise use of our sexual creative energy to merge those essences that we released with the psychological death. We are going to merge them in our spine for the process of internal creation to occur, and that with the practice of the supersex. And the third factor, which is the sacrifice for humanity, will help us to awaken conscious love in each of those essences so that they serve the purpose of the being. And once we receive this knowledge, and actually there are really few who, among so many theories and so many schools of pseudo-esoteric type, actually manage to find the pure knowledge. And that is why that biblical phrase that says, "Out of 1,000 who seek me, one finds me." But if we are one of 1,000 who find the objective knowledge, at that moment, two paths are open to us. Some will receive this knowledge and they will take the path of the believer. They will have it as one more theory, they will not practice it, and therefore they will not use this knowledge as that impulse or shock to start ascending in the following notes. And there, that biblical phrase continues when it says that out of 1,000 who find me, who finds the objective knowledge, only one follows me. And actually there this phrase is fulfilled. And since there are really very few who begin to practice, to take the path of the practitioner, and then they receive that shock and begin through the practice of the supersex to create themselves internally. Therefore, they begin to ascend through the next three notes, which are the notes Fa, Sol, La, and that is the creation of their solar astral body, their solar mental body, and their solar causal body, thus becoming true men with a real internal constitution, because they will regenerate the physical body they already have, but in a lunar state, and they will turn it, in a solar state. Also, they will regenerate a vital body, and they will create astral, mental, and causal bodies. So there, they definitely create their human soul, and they become the so-called men of the sixth day, men made in the image and likeness of God, by carrying out a process which is internally called the genesis, or the creation from the waters in the first mountain, which consists in the creation of the solar bodies. However, at this point, the second pass occurs. At this point, the first part of this work is barely being completed. But when we begin the process of creating the causal body, we are presented with the proof of the choice of the path. And here, at this point, we will have to choose between the path of nirvana, which is a very tempting path, where we will receive all the rewards for the hard work done up to that point, and we will have, if we choose nirvana, we will have the right to live for perhaps hundreds or thousands of years in the so-called paradises of the nirvana. But having, barely reached the level of man, having to sooner or later return to the wheel of samsara to try to start the path again, waiting for that time to complete it. And having, betrayed their intimate Christ, since only by taking the direct path, that force that is called Christ can be born in us. That force, that Christ, is actually what is going to turn us from a man or an angel into a superman or a resurrected master. At that point, when we are in choosing the path, we or approximately 70% of consciousness has been rescued. Almost all our visible moon has been cleaned, but however, we still have alive all the defects related to our invisible moon, and the cause selves, or the cause eyes, or the seven seats of the ego are still alive, and or as only the Christ in the work of the second mountain can do the work of eliminating these eyes in the infra dimension of the planet Earth, thus liberating the totality of our consciousness. But unfortunately, the vast majority take the path of nirvana. It is said that out of 1,000 people who reach that point, 999 choose the path of nirvana, and fulfilling there the third part of that biblical phrase that concludes by saying, out of 1,000 who follow me, only one is mine. Those who, on the contrary, choose at that point to do the will of the Father, choosing the direct path, will then have the right to unite with their divine soul, that is represented by that Buddhic body. We talk about the 7 bodies in lecture number 10, in case you haven't seen that. And there is going to happen what is known as the perfect marriage. That is the union between the human and the divine. You know, the human soul is representing that triangle that goes up, and the divine soul is representing the triangle that goes down. And that when they were united, they form that six-pointed star, or a star of David, which is the star that announces the birth of the Christ. Since it is from this union of the human soul and the divine soul that the Christ, or the Christ force, will be born in us. And that Christ force is actually represented by the atomic body. And so the third shock is actually represented by the birth of the Christ in the heart of the man. That igneous force in us that will guide us and will do all the work of the second mountain, which and the second mountain is also known as the apocalypse, or the end by fire of all the subhuman elements that we have inside us. With this shock, we then overcome that second pass, and we are entitled to the musical note T. The musical note T is the work of the second mountain. There, those bodies or solar vehicles will be transformed into vehicles of pure gold, so that this Christic force can actually incarnate in men. And it is in the second mountain where all the entire process of the descent of the Christ to hell, or to the infra dimensions of planet Earth, will take place to completely eliminate even the last shadow of our ego, to eliminate even the seeds of the ego that are the seven cause eyes. Actually, apocalypse means end by fire, and it refers to that moment in which our Christ, who, as we spoke in lecture number 28, where we were talking about what Christ is, it represents the fire in us, and that Christ will do that total work of psychological death. The process of elimination of the cause eyes will comprise the third and the last path that we will find on our path towards self-realization. And to overcome that third path and to conquer that higher dough, a fourth shock will need to be given, which will occur at the moment in which the process of elimination of the cause eye is completed, which is dying in oneself, and then the resurrection as a new man without a trace of ego. And with this, culminating the work of the second mountain and beginning the work of the third mountain, which is the mountain of the sacrifice for humanity, in which the master will have to find a disciple to leave him in charge of world teaching, since there must always be a master in charge of teaching knowledge on the planet. And also another work that this master must do in the third mountain is to turn those bodies of gold into bodies of light. To that second birth can take place when it is born now in the spiritual world. There he unites with his being and becomes an absolute man. And when the person manages to advance from this lower dough to this higher dough, it is said that he has been born for the second time. The second birth would be to become resurrected. And actually, this alternative is open to all human beings, but it is absolutely necessary to know how to do the work and how to apply the three factors for consciousness revolution, and they need to know about, how to climb in the first mountain, which is the mountain of the creation of the bodies, the mountain of birth, which is the recovery of the waters, which is the Genesis. Then the process of the second mountain, which is the mountain of the death, the elimination of all the psychological defects, the apocalypse. And the third mountain, which is the mountain of the sacrifice for humanity, where needs to find to find a disciple. Then we saw how this law of octaves is what is going to lead us to achieve that macro purpose of our existence, which is to achieve the self-realization of our being. However, we must learn to observe how this law of octaves is actually being processed in our daily living. Since the different trials that we face daily and that are the ones that give us, the daily progress in our inner work, we are also going to find those three pauses that we have to transcend. We, let's say, intend to do this work and we begin to create continuity of purposes in relation to a practice. For example, we decide to dedicate a daily amount of time to the study of oneself through reflective meditation. Let's say we take 1 hour during the night, but we are going to see how resistance is going to appear immediately due to the law of entropy, in which all our psychological defects put us, so that we don't advance in this work. And we will see how situations are going to present us bad will, confusion, doubt, and we will have to give ourselves those conscious shocks to gain impulse and overcome those pauses until we achieve a stability in that practice. When we actually manage to overcome all the pauses, the three pauses, we will have a great strength to carry out that practice every day and have a center of gravity around that practice. And now that we saw what the law of octaves is, let's see what is the law of entropy. The law of entropy is also called the equalization law. Everything in this physical world is actually subject to this law. We see, for example, that if we put a pot full of hot water next to another full of cold water, we see how the entropy precipitates. There is like an exchange of heat and cold, and finally both remain the same temperature. And we see if we put a rotten fruit among a group of fresh fruits, by entropy, in a short time, all the fresh fruits end up rotting, matching, the damaged one. That is what this law does. It always tends to match us to the lowest, take us to the lowest vibratory level possible. But we must know that actually this law fulfills a very important function, and that is that we have the necessary resistance to develop force. We see, for example, that a person who wants to develop physical strength needs elements or weights that represents that resistance that will lead him to develop those muscles, that strength that he requires. Well, actually, that is the purpose of this law. But it happens that nobody knows how to use this law consciously. People usually give up at the first resistance. We like the easy, and the easier thing is to descend. Millions of people are stuck on the path of entropy. Since they don't work on themselves, they become more and more degenerate, their minds get atrophy, their energy centers are increasingly unbalanced, they are increasingly subject to vices, to materialism, pornography, violence, and so on. And if we actually observe ourselves, we can see how this law of entropy is always being processed in us. We can see it when we thoughtlessly want to do what everyone does, what is popular. So we are looking to see which is the most popular series, or we fall into the incessant search for pleasure and money, as everyone else is doing. And we can see how we fall into entropy when we see, let's say, that friends are criticizing someone or gossiping about someone's life, or how such thing that such a famous person did is being commented on by everyone. And there we go, and we also want to find out what happened, and we also want to give our opinion, so we match ourselves with everyone else. So we see, or we can see it also, let's say when we arrive home in good spirits and we find that there is a fight between our relatives, and that like irritate us, and we end up annoyed and furious, and we actually fail to observe how the law of entropy made us equal to the environment at that moment. And the problem with getting into entropy is that we lose the octave, we lose the impulse that we had to move forward. And driven by this law, we all end up the same, reaching the end of our lives without having undergone a process of liberation and of awakening of our consciousness. And no matter if we manage to accumulate a lot of fame or wealth, and that when we die they bury us in a golden coffin, or if we died poor and we are buried in a simple wooden coffin, we'll end up just as bony as the other. The law of entropy immolate us all in tatters. And all things are marked under the law of entropy. It is found in everything. We see the seas turned into garbage dumps, the polluted rivers, the dying fish, the atmosphere, how it is polluted by smog, the adulterated fruits of the earth, and that is the law of entropy. Everything is like going down, and all humanity is actually going down that same path. So now, how are we going to avoid falling into entropy? How are we going to overcome this resistance and to advance our level of inner work in higher octaves? Well, actually, only through transformation it is possible to overcome entropy. And we achieve transformation when we are willing to sacrifice ourselves. To sacrifice our egoic desires that are the ones that always put us in entropy. When we are able to observe what is the acting defect that wants to lead me to lose strength, to make mistakes, be it laziness, be it greed, lust, anger, envy, whatever. And when we eliminate it, and how we saw in the previous lecture where we were talking about the radical change, there we decide to never feed it anymore, to be radical. If we get there, if we sacrifice desire, if we refuse to feed the ego, then the result is transformation. The result is freedom. Our strength is currently trapped in all our desires. And when we deny ourselves to our constant desires, when we sacrifice the desire to do what the ego wants, or the desire of not doing the things of the consciousness, then we recover the strength to continue advancing in this path. And what results from sacrifice? Well, the results of sacrificing our defects will always be the development in us of the virtue that is contrary to the defect. If one sacrifices anger, the precious gem of gentleness then appears. If one sacrifices the desire for money, the altruism will be born in us. If envy is sacrificed, then that philanthropic energy will manifest in us. Also, will manifest the desire to work for one's neighbor and the joy for the good of others. So we can see that there cannot be transformation without sacrifice. And likewise, for the man who sacrifices his sexual impulses, the result of that energy is the creation of the existential bodies of the being. If the eyes are sacrificed, if they are all destroyed, then you know, actually we are going to be able, with that energy that is released, to rise in us that profound inner man. So one escapes from the entropy. But it happens that people don't really want to sacrifice. We don't really even understand what sacrifice is. One believes that sacrifice is feeling pain, but actually, the first thing that we need to start by sacrificing is our suffering. And one discovers that of all the things to which we are most like attached to, what hurts the most to let go is to let go our sufferings. People are willing to sacrifice their pleasures, even their vices and their money. They will sacrifice everything, but not their sufferings and pains, because we love them so much. And suffering is actually that strong resistance that always leads us to lose any strength we have, with which we propose to advance in any aspect. It is just observing ourselves when we are in a state of melancholy, sadness, depression, anguish, resentment, or anger, and we see how we gloat in that state, how we search our minds for more justifications and excuses to continue feeding those feelings. And those feelings actually are the ones that lower us to the lowest vibratory levels and that make us lose all courage and all strength to awaken our consciousness. So, if we start by sacrificing our feelings, by sacrificing our suffering, we can take a big step to overcome the law of entropy. For this, we must not admit suffering. We must never think about suffering. When one sacrifices one's sufferings, when one eradicates from oneself the eyes that produce suffering, and the suffering there remains sacrificed, then the eye of suffering, you can see, can be eradicated. It must be eradicated. That energy, that result from there is actually transformation, because a different man is going to be born in us, and that man is always going to overcome the law of entropy. And finally, I want to mention that in relation to sacrifices and how they serve as an impetus to move forward, we must bear in mind that when we sacrifice ourselves for others, when we develop conscious love for all humanity, when we help others so that they can wake up, so that they can also transform, so that they can also advance spiritually, we receive in return a lot of strength to be able to advance in our own inner work. And I remind you that there can be no transformation without sacrifice. And well, actually, this was today's topic. Thanks to those who have seen the video. I hope it has helped you learn how to develop the strength to do your own inner work. And as always, I invite you to our next lecture that will be next Sunday. And that lecture is a complement to this one, since in this lecture we saw how to develop strength for the inner work, and in the next one, that is entitled The Permanent Center of Gravity, we will see how to achieve continuity of purposes so that we can dedicate the entirety of our existence to the inner work by achieving a permanent center of gravity around our consciousness. So, not being more, have a happy rest of the day and see you next time. Ciao, ciao.